worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story.
I was camping alone on a route close to the White Mountains mountain range, 1 hour north of Fairbanks, Alaska. I had already spent 2 days at the location with my tent and everything set up. I had built a bonfire early and was having a dinner around it when a man appeared just after midday. I was shocked since for the 2 days I had been out there I had not seen any animals at all. Additionally, I didn't hear him approaching or even see where he came from, the wilderness or the trail. However, he appeared to be a normal camper. Everything, even backpack gear, and he appeared to be rather polite. All he asked was if I knew the location of the cabin. I knew what he meant, even though I had never visited the cabin he was referring to. These public shelters, which resemble tiny huts, are available on many of the local trails for short-term usage while hiking. They are typically only available on a first-come, first-served basis and are not adequately maintained. Over the course of my 2 days at this campsite, I noticed a distinct narrow route leading into the forest which I imagined led to one of those shelters. If there was a cabin out here, it was probably down there, I told the man. After thanking me, he turned to leave. I didn't give it much further thought. I was just shocked that there was another person out here. I spent the remainder of the day taking care of the fire and unwinding. I had intended to spend my final night here before returning, so all I wanted to do was take in the peace and beauty. It was most likely 9 or 10 p.m. However, in Alaska, the sun doesn't actually set at this time of year. It becomes dark, although not as dark as it would be in most other locations. As the sun began to set and created a shadow over the forest, I noticed someone approaching me from among the trees. I recognized the camper from earlier as they approached. I was understandably perplexed as to why he was here, but he immediately clarified that he was unable to locate the refuge. Maybe there wasn't one. I really didn't know, I responded, but the man corrected himself, stating that he had never discovered the trail I was referring to and that he was expecting I would lead him to it. I found it odd that he had been gone for so long. Why was he returning hours later if he had never discovered the trail? If he wasn't staying in the shelter, what was he doing all that time? At first, I only tried to reiterate the location of the route, but he seemed determined that I take the lead. He said he didn't have a tent and was depending on that shelter for the night, which kind of guilt-tripped me. I decided to just walk him to the path since I felt horrible about it, even though I didn't want to and thought this whole situation was a little strange. In any case, it wasn't far. I threw my backpack over my shoulders and began guiding him in that direction. It was a 10-minute trek into the woodland where I was certain I had spotted it. The man was rather quiet the entire way there. We didn't say anything while we strolled together. Something seemed to have altered. However, I discovered the trail 10 minutes later. It was precisely where I had stated, as if he could not possibly have missed it. Even more bizarre was the fact that I could see the shelter in the distance toward its end. Even though it was far away and much of it was blocked by trees, there's no way he couldn't have found it with the directions I gave him. The man didn't appear to be content even after we moved a little closer. He told me this wasn't the proper cabin instead of saying thank you or whatever. I had no idea what he meant. We continued to walk till we almost reached the cabin. It certainly didn't appear to be in good condition, but using these kinds of public shelters always carries some danger. Really, you should never depend on them. With its cracked windows, rotten wood, and general appearance of being abandoned for years, this one appeared worse than others. As I looked at it, I noticed that the man had been silent. I pivoted. He was standing around 10 feet tall and had stopped moving, and extending a knife a foot away from me. His eyes were dead-eyed and his face was rigid. In a flat, impersonal voice, he told me to enter. He told me once more to enter the cabin without responding. When I tried to inquire what the heck he was doing, I had a lot of adrenaline. In addition to being furious that he had used my helpfulness, I was terrified since I was out here by myself with him. I came to the conclusion that entering the cabin was probably the worst course of action. I dropped my backpack and began to sprint because there was still some distance between us. Strangely, I didn't hear him pursuing me. Once I moved farther into the woods, I turned to check behind me, and he was still just staring at me while holding the knife. I found a suitable spot to hide once I was farther into the forest, and I stayed there for about half an hour. I hoped the person would have enough time to get out. I then made my way back to the shelter by stealthily moving through the trees in the darkness. Not only was the man no longer standing outside the cabin as he had previously, but my bag had also vanished. I reasoned that discarding it would allow me to flee more quickly. But now that he wasn't pursuing me, I thought it could have been a poor choice. That bag included almost everything I needed. Everything, including my wallet, phone, and keys. I left the area in silence and headed back to my campground. As I approached, I sensed that I was no longer alone, and my heart began to beat more quickly. Then I noticed it, a campfire blazing in the center of my campsite. I assumed it would have burned by now, out. I noticed that my tent was still up and that the man was nowhere to be found when I moved a bit closer. It was simply the quiet, crackling fire and the almost peaceful woods. Then I noticed my bag, though. It was situated in the center of the campsite. I thought this was very suspicious, but there was a part of me that really wanted to run up and seize it. He brought it back, but why? He had to have. I was aware that I would return to the cabin to retrieve my suitcase. I would then return to the campsite if I couldn't find it. I was going to hurry up and grab it, even though I knew all of that and that this had to be too wonderful to be true, when the man suddenly materialized. He nonchalantly emerged from the shadows behind the campfire, threw in a few more sticks, and took a seat. He seemed at ease and patient as I could hear him humming to himself. That. After turning around, I located the main route and hiked all the way back to the road in the dark. It took me hours to find a car that would assist me. After I alerted the police, they sent rangers into the forest early in the morning, but they found nothing. My belongings vanished as if they had never been there. In an attempt to hide the fact that it was ever a campground, even the stones from the campfire were shifted and tossed back into the forest. The lodge out there was discontinued, which simply meant that no rangers were maintaining or servicing it anymore, the rangers also told me. I was quite uncomfortable after that meeting for a long period. I was unable to put my trust in anyone. Even though I've improved with time, I can't stop wondering what could have happened if I had tried to retrieve my suitcase or entered that abandoned shelter. I was probably just one poor choice away from being in those woods forever. I was on a quick camping vacation in the Maine forests with a boyhood friend of mine, who I'll name Ethan. Both of us had a good deal of experience, but this was Ethan's first visit to this location. However, I was somewhat familiar with the region because I had been there many times previously. We set up camp in a clearing in the trees after backpacking down a track that took many hours. We got there about 6 o'clock, I believe. After preparing everything, we created a lovely campfire, prepared some food, opened a few beers, and relaxed by the fire while the sun began to set. It was a fun and relaxed evening. However, about 2 hours into the night, we both heard what we believed to be something moving just outside our campsite. That is, in the darkness beyond the light from our campfire. Nothing was visible when we looked. We didn't hear anything else for the remainder of the evening. We assumed it was simply a tiny animal running away. To be honest, I never would have remembered it or given it further thought if nothing else had happened. At the time, it seemed so unimportant. If you're not experienced with camping, it may sound unusual, but since you're out here all the time, those kinds of noises are common and almost never cause for concern. After having a few beers and growing weary, we decided to call it a night, extinguished the fire, and retired to our tents to sleep. We got up early in the morning since there was a reason this location was fantastic. This is because the campsite was about a half-mile through the woods from a really private, remote pond. Since the trail didn't truly lead to it, nobody was aware of it. However, it was quite lovely, with a tiny river and waterfall flowing through it. The majority of our morning, roughly 3 or 4 hours, was spent there. We eventually returned to prepare supper and take a short break. I even napped for a little while. But once more the sun was setting at 6 o'clock, and we still hadn't gathered any firewood for the campfire. The majority of the dry sticks that are lying. We slept last night in the vicinity of the camp. In order to get what we needed, I had to do a bit more searching. Ethan said halfway through that he would stroll around and simply explore the other sections, picking up anything he could on the way back. Sure, I replied and carried on picking up twigs from the floor. Almost every time we went camping, Ethan would do this. I believe he simply relished spending time by himself and taking in the scenery. Nevertheless, I returned to the camp after gathering a sizable quantity of firewood. Only I wasted time waiting for Ethan to return so I could light the fire. As the sun continued to set, I finally came to the realization that he had been gone for an oddly long time. He wasn't usually out for this long, and he had enough experience to know that it wasn't a good idea to explore the woods so close to sundown. Our little satellite messengers were the only means of communication available to us out here, without service. Along with bear spray and other such items, we always carried these in our little garbage bags. Although it is often more of an SOS gadget, it was also useful in circumstances like these. When I took mine out to message him, I discovered that he had just sent me one moments earlier. Ethan claimed that he stumbled back to the pond after getting somewhat lost. "Just stay there," I told him in a message, "and I'll be right over to guide him back. If you're lost, it's usually best to stay still rather than take the chance of being lost again." And Ethan and I were both aware of that. Knowing the region, I promptly made my way to the pond. It was essentially a race against the sun at this point. It would still be very simple to get lost during the day, even with headlamps and familiarity with the terrain. At night, I received another message while I was approximately 4 or 5 minutes away from the pond. I assumed it would be him checking in or requesting an ETA, so I reached inside my bag and checked it. However, I wasn't even close to the pond when Ethan gave me the message. "I see you." What did he mean? Confused, I stopped and glanced about, but I couldn't find him. I stated that I had not yet arrived, and failed to notice him. I began to move more quickly, practically racing to the pond because I was a little concerned. I arrived swiftly, sprinting up to the treeine ahead of the water. There was no Ethan. I could see the entire treeine surrounding the pond from where I was, but he was nowhere to be seen. I yanked the messenger back out as I felt the blood flow from my face. I hadn't opened my previous mail stating that I hadn't seen him. My voice reverberated through the trees as I yelled his name. The jungle was growing darker and quieter as the sun was almost completely gone. Perhaps he had already begun to return, as if he had somehow memorized the route. Where else would he be? I'm not sure why he would. I knew it would be safer for me to return to the camp and figure things out now that the daylight was almost completely gone. I haven't yet lit the fire. I would therefore never be able to locate the campsite in the dark if I waited too long. I started to walk, feeling apprehensive as I made my way through the trees and saw how dark the woods were growing. The menacing last message he sent was all I could think about. "You are visible to me." By the time I was about a minute away from the clearing, it was almost completely dark. However, I noticed a flickering orange glow directly from the location of the tent. The campfire was lighted, and I could see that someone was standing close to it as I approached. With a sense of relief that Ethan had returned safely, I began to move closer. However, as I approached, the person abruptly changed and turned to face me before running out of the campsite and away from the fire. With my heart racing, I hurried up, scared and perplexed. Ethan wasn't that person. I took out my messenger once more and began sending out spam texts. I was now rather concerned and troubled by the situation. However, Ethan ran out of the woods and into the campfire about a minute later. His expression was one of relief and terror. He said we had to go right away. He said it was probably the same guy he saw approaching him by the pond when I mentioned the man I saw by the fire. He claimed that until he came closer and saw it was someone else, he believed it to be me. The man reportedly didn't answer when Ethan tried to ask whether he knew how to return to the trail. With a rather unnerving smirk on his face, he simply continued to advance. Additionally, Ethan claimed that there was something quite strange about him, such as an eerie quality to his face. There was just something out of the ordinary about it. In a panic, he fled in what he believed to be the direction of the campsite, getting confused once more before spotting the fire and moving in its direction. After packing, we departed. To put it mildly, the walk back was frightening, but we made it to our car and drove off. This incident caused me to reflect on the entire camping vacation, recalling the activity we heard outside our camp on the first evening, and simply assembling everything. The man out there was probably keeping an eye on us the entire time, waiting for one of us to be by ourselves. It is really unsettling to even consider his existence outside our campsite while we were conversing, sleeping, and doing everything we had no idea about. Though we never want to return to those woods, we nevertheless occasionally discuss that camping trip. Even though this was in 2016, I can still clearly recall every aspect of the evening. I spent a lot of time in the forest to the south of my town, at least 4 or 5 times a year. I kind of just felt the need to go out and spend some time by myself this past weekend. I drove down to my favorite trail after hastily packing my backpack. To be honest, I have no idea if the trail that was shown on maps was indeed a real one. I'm not sure if it was well known because no one ever hiked or camped on it. After parking close to the trees on the side of the road, I grabbed my luggage and trekked for 2 hours. There were no mountains in this area of the forest. It was merely heavily covered with trees and extremely flat. Excellent for a leisurely camping excursion lasting 1 or 2 days, but nothing longer because it can become monotonous. There wasn't much to the campsite. I took my time making everything perfect and lighting the bonfire because there were still a few hours until dusk. I ate some trail mix and unwinded while listening to the birds tweeting and the cozy fire. I threw in additional sticks as the sun sank. I've always thought it's fascinating how the forest can shift from being so vibrant to practically instantly becoming silent. Once the sun has set, only approximately 25 minutes after dark did I sit there and listen to the silence before an odd sound broke the stillness. It was music. It sounded like an ancient classical song and was coming from a considerable distance. It sounded nearly like a vintage record player. I got up and turned to face the direction it was coming from. Was there another campground close by? Perhaps it was a group of people performing music, albeit loudly in a casual manner. I spent some time just listening at my campground. At least half an hour was required. However, the tune never changed, which was strange and, to be honest, a little unsettling. The emptiness of the quiet woods was filled with the same classical melody on loop. Normally, I don't give a damn whether other campers are close by having a boisterous campfire party or doing anything else, but today felt different. I didn't like the way things were going. I made the decision to get a little closer to observe what was happening after those 30 minutes. I wanted to make sure it was nothing strange so I could sleep tonight, but I didn't want to pry on anyone. I reached for my flashlight and began to move in the direction of the sound. It seemed even stranger that I could hear it from so far away, because I felt like I was traveling quite a distance. But the closer I got and the louder the music, the more eerie it became. My heart was beating a little quicker and I could tell I had goosebumps. I realized then that all I had packed was my flashlight. I didn't even consider bringing my pocket knife or pepper spray, even though I should have. I eventually realized that I was getting quite close. There had to be music coming. I was about 30 or 40 feet away, but I was unable to see anything. No campfire, bonfire, or other type of light. Then I noticed it. A massive speaker was perched somewhat behind a tree. It was surrounded by nothing. I looked everywhere with my flashlight, but I couldn't find anyone. I approached the speaker. It appeared to be from the early 2000s. It's basically a huge box with an outdated LCD screen and worn-out control buttons. I located the power button and switched it off. The woodland was silent all of a sudden. It was unsettling how drastically different it was. This was done by whom? Even though it felt like a trap or something, I thought up every reason why it wasn't. For example, that another camper might have accidentally left it behind. It didn't make any sense. However, I didn't want to believe it was the worst. I didn't remain any longer than necessary. Relieved to see my campfire and return to what felt like the security of my tent, I rushed back to my campground. But as the minutes went by, I couldn't get rid of this odd feeling that hovered over me. Like something wasn't quite right, but I had no idea what it was. The sensation worsened until I recalled my knives and pepper spray, believing that I would feel safer if I kept them close at hand. However, that's when I became aware of the problem. Items were absent. My cooking utensils, matches for igniting fires, knife and pepper spray were all suddenly gone. My body stiffened. There was a person present. I packed what was left without even needing to give it another thought. And I heard it once again as I did. The sound of music coming from the shadows of the forest. However, it was closer, certainly not far from where I had previously discovered it. I rushed, leaving the campground and sprinting for the trail. As soon as I began to feel a little better as I went on and heard the music fade, I was still terrified. But I reasoned that I was getting farther away from whatever was out there because they had to be near the speakers where the music was coming from. After strolling through the peaceful woodland for about 15 minutes, distant from any music, I noticed something lying on the dirt trail in front of me. It belonged to me. Everything was vanished, including the cutlery, knives, and pepper spray. It was neatly arranged in the center of the trail. What was the catch? I heard a rush of footsteps behind me before I could seize any of it. When I turned to look behind me, all I saw was blackness. I simply ran away, leaving everything behind. I jogged or fast-walked the remaining distance after running for what seemed like 10 full minutes. Fortunately, I managed to leave the forest and return to the road. I honestly have no idea what the hell happened to me that evening. I felt like I just barely got away from a crazy person, almost like they were playing with their meal. I never intended to return to that woodland, and I haven't. I experienced this about 8 years ago, and I've been thinking about it nonstop. I was camping in the upper Idaho backcountry when I was in my early 20s. Although I wouldn't consider myself an expert camper just yet, I did go on lengthy hikes quite a bit and was familiar with the fundamentals. Additionally, there was a lot of wildlife in that area, such as grizzly and black bears, so being ready was essential, which discouraged many casual campers and hikers. There aren't many residents up there either, and the only people you might see on a trail are tourists. In Upper Idaho, the majority of campgrounds are sparsely populated. Having said that, I made an effort to avoid those tourist attractions and stick to lesser-known paths, even though it was obviously unnecessary. I had selected one that was just outside the large, well-known mountain range for our trip. This trail just led to a pleasant open area with views of the mountain range. After passing through the forest and around the hills that flank the mountain, the closest trail I was aware of led to a little lake 3 miles distant, which I assumed may have a few other individuals, which is why I didn't attend. But I was correct. No one else was around during my entire hike. When I arrived at the campground, it was open and deserted, and the route appeared to be essentially deserted. I located some large stones to construct a fire pit and pitched my tent on the far side. I didn't have any plans for the remainder of the day because I only had 2 or 3 hours of daylight remaining. Just take a seat at the campsite and consider what I want to do tomorrow. I stargazed while building up the fire and roasting some marshmallows as the sun went down. With only a light breeze blowing through and the rare animal shouting out, the entire valley was incredibly calm. However, the quiet was broken by something. The sound of leaves crunching repeatedly emanates from the forest. It was fairly clear after a moment that someone was walking. Until they were at the edge of my campground, I had no idea what to do but sit there and stare in that direction, kind of astonished and perplexed as to why someone was out there. It was a man, but I couldn't tell much about them because of the flickering shadows cast by the flame. They were wearing a standard camping backpack as far as I could tell. Before I could say anything, they turned around and walked back the exact direction I heard them come from, after standing there staring at me and the rest of my campground. Additionally, it seemed as though they were attempting to be silent when they apologized. It was scarcely audible above a whisper. It was quite peculiar. For what even did they apologize? They must be trying to find a place to camp. They couldn't have been aimlessly strolling around at night in that manner. I suppose it felt really disturbing. Although their actions were not typical of any hiker I had ever encountered, I didn't feel in danger. As they left, their footsteps faded into the quiet, subdued night of moments before, as if nothing had happened. It was only a few minutes later that I returned to stargazing and unwinding, despite the strange interruption. I didn't give it much more thought except to pray that the man would reach his destination quickly and safely. A few hours passed, or at least it seemed that way. The moon and stars were obscured as clouds began to drift in, covering the entire woodland with a shadow. I remained by the campfire, hoping that soon I would become bored and drowsy enough to call it a night. But then I heard footsteps once again. I wasn't quite tired or ready to sleep yet. This time they were more hurried, almost like terrified footsteps sprinting through the forest in the same spot that the man had come from earlier in the evening. I got up, growing anxious as they got closer. Then he emerged into the light. It was the same hiker from earlier, based on his general appearance and the backpack. This time he went higher, sufficient for me to see him more clearly. He had oily black hair, a medium-sized, scruffy beard, some marks of discomfort on his clothes, filth all over his face, and big, frightened eyes. His lips, however, was lifeless and straight. "Is everything all right? By now you ought to have arrived at your campsite. It's quite late." While catching his breath, the man remained vigilant. "Are you lost? Maybe I can help," I asked after he briefly glanced over my right shoulder before turning back to face me. Then he murmured under his breath that he didn't mean to annoy me, and that he was simply trekking in the woods. However, he spoke slowly, and throughout his gaze kept moving to something on my right. Listen, you look pretty nervous," he would say after glancing at me for a few moments. He appeared to dismiss what I said, but then he fixed his gaze on me more firmly than before. "I can help. Maybe send a radio message for you or whatever you need. You're currently camping here. Why?" It was somewhat unnerving how he asked it. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder as his eyes went to my right once more. Dark, empty forests. I didn't see anything. I wasn't sure how much longer I wanted to talk to this person, much less try to assist him with whatever was going on, because I was starting to feel pretty uneasy. Then he posed an even more unsettling question. "Are you alone here? Are you by yourself? The others are where?" I was surprised by the question and was reluctant to answer at first. And he said again before I could respond, "Have you been keeping up with me?" There was a problem. He was tensing up and his demeanor was shifting. "No," I replied, adding that I had no idea what he was talking about. However, his gaze then returned to something over my shoulder, but they didn't move back to me this time. His hollow, wide eyes were fixed on something. He posed one final query, "So why are you with her?" I quickly spun around and peered over my right shoulder, but my gaze was still fixed on the dark, empty woods. I turned to face the man again. His expression turned terrified as he continued to look past me. But then he abruptly started to run farther into the forest. He was gone in a matter of seconds, having passed all the lights. He ran in a direction that had nothing to do with the trail, but my heart was still pounding. I was scanning my surroundings, particularly behind me, in an attempt to determine what the hell that man was discussing and what he was observing. I believed I had made the connection in those fleeting seconds following his question. Then why are you with her? That a woman or group of people were pursuing this man in the forest. I was quite prepared to see her standing behind me, scary and insane when I turned to look over my shoulder. However, I was unsure of what to think at this point, but I was so terrified that I had no intention of remaining any longer. After gathering everything, I began to move. I felt tense the entire walk, even though I could see the person racing away from the route. I was shocked by every little sound and thought I may see a woman after me or whoever the hell he was talking about, but I never did. I arrived at my car and drove off. After giving it some more thought, I was quite concerned about the guy, so the next morning I made the decision to leave a note at the local police station. After speaking with scores of people over the years, I can offer a reasonable perspective for the scenario, even though I don't have a precise explanation for what happened that evening. The most tragic and plausible explanation. It's possible that the man got lost and spent a lot of time out there, becoming so hungry and dehydrated that he became almost insane and paranoid, believing that someone or something was pursuing him through the woods at night. Unfortunately, he didn't recognize aid when he saw it since he wasn't in the correct frame of mind. He was probably too suspicious to realize that I might have saved him by providing him with food and water and allowing him to leave the woods when he discovered me. It's possible that he was so engrossed in his panic over the person he believed was pursuing him that he forgot he was lost. Although this is the most likely reason for the man's actions and the veracity of what transpired that evening is still unknown, it's possible that he was actually being followed and didn't trust me because he wasn't sure whether I was just another stalker in the group. If so, his frightening me that evening probably prevented me from dying at the hands of anyone else. But it's unlikely that we will ever know for sure. Sadly, it appears that the man never made it out of the woods because he was never located or seen again. As a frequent camper and backpacker in the middle of summer, one of my friends told me about rental fire lookouts. They were reportedly abandoned lookout posts, typically located in remote areas far into the forest. The one I selected was essentially the most remote one I could locate. I enjoyed hiking anyhow, and renting it was simpler because there were slots available almost all summer long. I really had no idea what to anticipate from the lookout tower because there was only one image of it that I could find, and it was quite ancient and fuzzy. I figured it would be old because it was constructed in the 1950s. However, I had no idea how much restoration had been done. I started the hike at 9 a.m. with my standard backpacking equipment. In terms of views, there wasn't much out there, not in the initial hours. It was simply a rough, dense forest. The trail had become a fairly uneven path rather than much of a trail. But it took me 5 hours to catch a peek of the lookout tower. It was still far away, perched atop a mountain. It didn't appear to be elevated on stilts and appeared to be quite modest, perhaps elevated by 10 to 15 feet, It appeared more like a cabin than anything else. Before I finally arrived, I had to hike for an additional hour. The scenery alone made the hike worthwhile. From there, it seemed as though I could see the entire planet. Although the fire lookout was in poor condition, it was clearly quite old and had some patchwork, and some parts had been completed. The interior was completely vacant, and there was a wraparound staircase with around 20 steps that led up to the walkway that circled the entire viewpoint. To be honest, it could have been worse, even though it wasn't glamorous, and I would gladly accept this view any day. I put my luggage down, prepared some supper, and lounged on the outside ledge with only a few hours of sunlight remaining. Only the sound of the wind and birds could be heard up there. After the sun set, I spread my bedding on the wooden flooring and lay down because I was exhausted from the trek up. Even though I was tired, I was unable to fall asleep as quickly as I would have liked, because it was only around 8. 30 to 40 minutes passed, I believe. Then I heard what I believed was coming from outside the lookout tower. There were distinct footsteps coming up the stairs before I could even get up to see. I quickly got out of my sleeping bag and went to the door, which was noticeably unlocked. A man appeared around the corner a few seconds later. He had longish blonde hair and was elderly, perhaps in his late 40s. For some reason, he wasn't shocked to see me, as if he already knew I was up here. It's a great place to spend a few nights. With a smile on his face, he approached me. Still a little anxious, I consented and said I had reserved it for the following 3 nights. However, I was already a little put off because I knew there was nothing else nearby. So it seemed odd that he was here at the same time as me. I inquired as to whether he was camping nearby. Actually, I was hoping to be staying here tonight, he repeated, grinning. I didn't know how to react to that, so I just apologized. It appears that you have adequate space. I mean, you're the only one here, right? After a moment of hesitation, I told a falsehood, claiming that a buddy of mine was just a little while away and that we were unable to allow him to remain with us. He glanced at me with a fading smile, remained silent for a bit, nodded, and turned to walk away. I didn't realize he had no gear at all, not even a backpack, until he turned to go back down the steps. He must have left his pack close by. Couldn't understand why someone, especially if they intended to use the fire lookout as a shelter, would be this remote without any camping equipment. I stayed up a little later and simply gazed at the trees beneath the lookouts because I felt worried about that man. However, I eventually became quite drowsy, returned to my sleeping bag, and passed out. Feeling better, I spent the first hour of the morning brewing coffee and taking in the scenery. However, there was a letter affixed to the wooden railing at the bottom when I descended from the lookout. It was merely a sheet of paper with a happy face next to the word sorry. I figured it had to come from the man. However, if he placed something here, he must have returned while I was asleep at some point throughout the night. Just thinking about it made me feel quite uneasy right away. It was strange that he even left a note. I made the decision to take a walk in spite of the peculiar event. Since the man obviously didn't leave when he should have, perhaps it was also to look around for any indications that he was still there. I strolled through the forest below from the fire lookout on the hill, but there wasn't much to see. I didn't see any tents or abandoned items, and it was all the same dense forest I had trekked through the day before. For the remainder of the day, I returned to the lookout and relished the calm. Compared to the previous night, I remained up a lot later. I simply kind of existed with this little lantern that ran on batteries that I hung up on the wall to improve my vision. Whatever I was thinking, I gazed out at the darkness beyond the lookout, barely able to make out the form of the mountains. To be honest, I didn't begin getting ready for bed until around midnight. It might have even been 1 a.m. Before going to bed, I laid out my belongings, got my light, and went down the steps to the forest to quickly take a shower. I approached the tree's edge. However, I noticed something moving in front of me as soon as I arrived. I caught a glimpse of something moving out of my lantern's weak glow. I held it up farther forward after freezing for a little, but it didn't really help. There is a person there. What was even more unsettling was the hush that ensued after I spoke. In essence, I dashed back to the lookout. However, it didn't feel any safer. Every square inch of the walls was covered with windows, and as I previously stated, there was no lock on the door. There was a part of me that really wanted to go, but it would definitely be worse to leave now that it was completely dark, and the route was almost non-existent. I gazed out the windows at the woodland below while keeping the light up on the wall. Knowing that someone might possibly see me in the window if they were outside due to the light was extremely unsettling. In the meantime, all I observed was gloom. But since I could see the bottom of the steps, I was watching to make sure no one attempted to climb. This feeling of discomfort began to permeate my body the longer I watched. I made the decision to pack up my belongings even though I had no idea what to do. If I had to, I could at least flee at that point. I kept doing this until I had everything in my backpack and was prepared to leave, pausing every 30 seconds to go back up to the window and stare out at the steps before continuing to pack. After positioning it against the wall, I returned to the window. At the foot of the steps was a man. He was standing directly in front of the first step, gazing at it as if he were simply waiting. Through all the railings, I could only see a portion of him, but I knew it was the same man as yesterday. He appeared to be approximately the same height and was not wearing a backpack. I was very scared. Why had he returned? And why did he just standing at the bottom of the steps still? What if he made the decision to reappear? My mind was racing over everything. Before the man moved, I must have stood at the window and watched him for a full 2 minutes. After taking a few steps back and pausing briefly, he left. I couldn't see the path he took because of the sidewalk, so I didn't see him. And if he continued to enter, I couldn't see that far toward the trees since it was too dark. I was certain that the man was stalking me at the time, or at the very least keeping an eye on me and approaching too closely for comfort, especially at such a late hour. I had a feeling that something terrible would happen if I stayed any longer, but it might simply have been my intuition. After a few minutes of waiting, I picked up my backpack and stealthily down the stairs into the area beneath the observation tower. I can't even begin to express how uneasy I felt as I made my way from the tower into the pitch-black forest, knowing that there was a possibility the man was still observing me and might even be pursuing me into the trees. I kept my pocket knife open and in my hand the entire time because of this. Time. After about 15 minutes of walking, the track became much less distinct, so I had to take out my lantern. I hoped I was far enough away to prevent the man from following and from seeing the lights. The next 5 hours were incredibly uncomfortable, but by then, the sun had risen, allowing me to complete the trip and get out of the woodland. It's difficult, in my opinion, to really appreciate how terrifying those evenings were. I had a gut feeling that there was something wrong with that man and his intentions. One thing that keeps coming to mind is that I had informed the man that I had reserved the tower for 3 nights, so there was no need for him to return several times to see if I was still there. It also implies that he probably assumed I would stay for the 3rd night. Therefore, things might have taken a lot more unsettling turn if I had stayed for the 3rd night instead of leaving early. Midway through 2018, at the age of 23, I traveled to Vermont to spend a few weeks with my family. I also wanted to go camping there because when I still lived with my parents, their home was located just outside the Appalachian Mountains. I used to go out a lot, but since moving out, I haven't had the opportunity to go hiking or camping. I had been thinking about one particular location for some time. I discovered a trail on a site for individuals looking at abandoned buildings just before I moved, and I've wanted to get there ever since. An ancient cabin in the center of the forest is said to be reached along this trail. I drove out there on a Monday morning. The trail was unmarked, and I parked on the side of the road. Clearly, this was merely a rough trail created by strangers like me who wanted to investigate the deserted cabin. However, it appeared as though no one had gone down there in a long time because it was so overgrown. It took somewhat less than 2 hours to hike there. Even though it was largely level, the amount of weeds and bushes creeping into the path made it a challenging walk. Nevertheless, I succeeded. I decided to set up tent inside the lodge because, well, why not? However, I had a tent and everything ready in case it was totally damaged or whatever. I'm glad I did because it was obvious from the outside that camping there was not safe. The wood that built up the roof were covered in mold and thick vines, and the majority of the roof had collapsed into itself. However, the door was wide open, so I peered inside and took a look around. It had a terrible stench, and there wasn't much space for me to look around due to all the broken and rotted sections. I was attempting to enter a door that appeared to be intact at the far end of the main hallway, but it was a little too dubious, so I ultimately decided to back out. I had no further plans after that, but because the sun was already beginning to drop, I started searching for a suitable spot to camp. Since there weren't many choices, I simply created a small area to pitch my tent after walking 200 feet from the resort. The lodge in the distance gradually became invisible as the sun sank, and all the sounds of the forest gradually transformed into crickets in the cozy crackle of the little bonfire I had constructed. I was in an area where trees towered over me, obstructing much of my view, but I really wanted to stargaze. It was partly cloudy, too, so until I heard something, I just sat there tossing sticks into the fire and thinking about whatever was on my mind. It was quite loud, I'm not sure how to put it. Perhaps like bending or bowing wood. The sound was coming from the exact spot where I knew the lodge was sitting in the dark, even though I could no longer see it. Even though it was brief, it gave me the goosebumps. Perhaps it was just the wind causing the old wood to crack and flex. Perhaps there was another reason. For about half an hour, I sat and listened without hearing anything else. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep later if I didn't check on it now, even though it was just about an hour into the night. I decided that since it was still early in the evening, I might as well go take a look around. I added fuel to my campfire. Before I left, I added a few more sticks to avoid having to rebuild it. After that, I picked up my little LED lamp and headed for the lodge. The building was barely visible in the lights after just 1 minute of walking. As anticipated, it was eerie. I approached it warily, holding the light up as I went past a few broken windows. It was quite dark inside. I felt like I could hardly see anything, even with the light. I was somewhat taken aback when I reached the door. It was shut down. I left it open when I was here less than 2 hours ago. Then I saw another thing. The front face of the door had marks all over it, possibly from a knife or nails. The last time I didn't see them, so I wasn't sure if they were already there or if the sound I heard was a recent occurrence. For a few moments, I contemplated whether I should try opening it or just walk away. But it was all in vain because I was unable to open it when I had made up my mind to do so. Something on the other side seemed to be keeping it closed. I became quite uneasy and left. I hurried back into the woods in the direction of my tent, backing away from the lodge. But I could see right away that something wasn't right. The woodland was dark, save for my lantern. In the hopes that I was still heading in the correct way, I began to rush. Fortunately, I was. I returned to my tent after a minute. Above my campfire, there appeared a cloud of smoke, as though someone had suddenly extinguished it while it was still blazing. I stood with my lantern raised and peered around, hardly able to make out anything in the trees. Hi there. Who's out there?" No one answered. I knew it would only take 2 hours to walk back to my car when I started to get chills again. I made the snap decision to pack and leave. I heard someone nearby while I was packing the few things I had left in my backpack after taking down my tent. I paused and raised my lantern for a moment, but nothing was visible. Someone seemed to be chuckling. It was silent, not like a group of buddies laughing or anything. One person was watching me from behind the trees in the dark, giggling gently under their breath like if they were crazy. With my shoddy lantern, I booked it to the trail and rushed up, leaving fragments behind. I tried my best, but it was really difficult to follow the course. I worried that I was being followed several times and stopped believing I heard that quiet laugh. However, whomever was pursuing me was blending in with the darkness so well that I never saw them at all. I returned to the road, got into my car, and drove off. 7 years later, I consider that incident to be the most terrifying and unsettling thing that has ever happened to me. I doubt that anyone can fully comprehend the sense of powerlessness I experienced when being stalked by a crazy person at night in a remote forest. Perhaps they took up residence in the deserted lodge. I'm not entirely sure, however, I don't think anyone should return to discover what I saw and experienced there. This occurred in 2015. I had driven a couple hours away to a wilderness. I was eager to take the climb up to an abandoned fire lookout. Since it wasn't maintained and might be structurally dangerous, it was theoretically forbidden to enter or camp there. The last post I could find on it was 3 years ago, so I really didn't know what I would find when I got up there. However, I had done some research online and most people claimed it seemed acceptable. In any case, I was able to park in a little ditch on the side of the road. After that, I took out my 2-day supply of stuff from my backpack and began the journey. There aren't usually clear routes to get there on journeys like these. I was able to confirm that I was headed in the correct direction by using a handheld satellite GPS. But in reality, I was basically navigating through unfamiliar forest terrain the entire time. It took 4 to 5 hours to hike from the road. The landscape became more rugged and dense the farther I went. I was really hoping that the fire lookout would still be functional and suitable for camping. However, I suppose if not, after that, all I had to do was choose another close spot to pitch my tent and spend the night. I eventually arrived after hiking through the woods for several exhausting hours. The building was visible above the woods, and upon closer inspection, it appeared to be in a respectable form. Naturally, the paint had worn off, but it appeared to be doing very well. I tried my luck climbing the ladder after giving the support beams a few pushes and finding them to be quite sturdy. Even though it was made of metal and felt solid, every step up made it creak. I briefly marveled at the scenery when I reached the summit. Almost the whole woodland was visible to me. For miles in every way, there were no houses, roads, or structures. It was only the forest. I circled the ledge and entered the lookouts after admiring the scenery. It wasn't one of those large ones that are converted into Airbnbs or anything like that. This was a single room, perhaps 150 square feet. The entire wall was covered in crumbling windows, and there was an ancient wooden desk in one corner and a deteriorating bed in the other. There wasn't much more to examine. I laid my bag down, rolled out my mattress and sleeping bag, and used my little camping stove to cook a dinner. I went outside to the ledge and saw it as the sun began to set. I have never seen a better view than this one, but everything seemed to pass quickly, and then there was only darkness. There was no moonlight or stars illuminating the sky because it was cloudy outside, but since I had nothing else to do, I spent some time sitting on the edge. I noticed something beneath me around an hour into the night. There was in the treetops, a light was shifting, but what was peculiar about it was that it wasn't like artificial light. I thought it was a torch since it had an orange color and flickered somewhat like a bonfire. It was traveling through the forest not far from my location, between the trees. Since there wasn't even a trail to get here, there was very little possibility that anyone else would be out here at the same time as me in such a remote area of the woods. It was also somewhat strange to travel around at night with a torch instead of a standard flashlight. For a while, I observed how the light shifted beneath the trees. After that, I was unable to view it because it was hidden behind something. I didn't see anything again for the next half hour. However, I continued to stand on the edge and enjoy the peace and quiet of the night. It became a little chilly eventually due to the wind, so I got up to have one more look before going inside. But there was someone there as I peered below the ledge. They stood in the grassy space between the woods and the fire lookout at the bottom. They appeared to be staring straight up at me. Maybe it was the person with the light I saw earlier. "Hello," I said. I was at a loss for words. They remained motionless and didn't respond to me. They just stared at each other for 10 or 15 odd seconds before raising their hands as if to acknowledge or apologize. Then, still without a light, they turned around and headed into the woods. That was obviously really unsettling. However, I was certain at the time that it was just another hiker wishing to remain in the lookouts for some reason. Most likely, it was merely checking to see if somebody had previously entered. I'm not sure why he just raised his hand instead of answering. After spending a little more time outside and seeing nothing else, I went inside to warm up in my sleeping bag. The wind hitting the windows and the creaking wooden beams made it a little difficult for me to fall asleep, but in the end, I was able to nod out. It's difficult to gauge how much time has gone by. However, the wind had subsided by the time I woke up, and it was still rather dark outside. I wondered why I was abruptly awake when I opened my eyes, but suddenly I recognized the sound. Outside, the ladder's gentle metal creak. I thought I must be wrong as I sat up, but then I kept hearing it. The ladder was being climbed by someone. I was unable to determine how high or low they were. With each step they took, I could hear the hinges at the top of the ladder creak. Outside, however, it was totally black outside the windows. With my heart pounding, I unzipped my sleeping bag, picked up my gear, and stepped onto the ledge. The creaking increased in volume and speed during the roughly 20 seconds it took to get up, as if they were rushing, but it abruptly stopped as soon as I reached the ledge. I waited for another sound for a little period. After that, I cautiously circled the walkway and looked around the corner at the ladder's opening. There was nobody present. I moved cautiously. I leaned forward and looked down, feeling my heart rate rise. There was no one on the ladder. For a brief moment, I was stunned, terrified and unsure of what on earth was happening. Then behind me, a startling series of footfall rushed around the wooden walkway. All I could see was their shadowy figure sprinting between the windows on the opposite side. I hurried down and lowered myself onto the ladder without hesitation. With someone running after me and my entire body trembling from the adrenaline high, it was terrible to try to down the slick metal ladder. Directly over me, before I could see their head peeking out from above, I had descended halfway. I continued until I reached the bottom and entered the woods. It was the best choice I've ever made. and I honestly don't know why I even reached for my backpack when I got up to check what was happening. Perhaps even saved my life. I managed to hike out of there and return to my car using my torch and GPS. I was not followed as far as I know. I never looked back after I drove off. My best friend and I were going camping. I will refer to him as Henry. Even though we had taken a few travels previously, we still largely thought of ourselves as novices. Up until now, we hadn't done anything really outrageous. Normally, we would visit nearby campgrounds with other people, but we felt comfortable enough to do something more daring. We both desired to set up camp in a real campsite that was cool, had a view, and was farther into the forest like actual camping. After doing some research, we discovered a location that was roughly 3 hours away. It didn't seem like it would be busy because it was a 4-hour journey into the forest and there were only a few photos from past campers. For 3 days, we prepared by driving down there. In the heart of the forest, there was a tiny patch of dirt at the end of an otherwise deserted road. There were no other cars parked there. At one point, the trail appeared to be an actual trail. Some of it was worn and overgrown because it hadn't been maintained. I wasn't anticipating the most well-maintained route because it seemed to be in the middle of nowhere, but it appeared to have been neglected for a long time. Nevertheless, we continued to stroll. As we moved farther into the forest, it became thinner, but by mid-afternoon we arrived at the campsite. It was nothing more than a grassy spot atop a tiny hill, but it was rather isolated and offered a respectable view of the forest. There was no one else present, and it appeared like no one had been there in a while. We unpacked everything and put up our tents. Since Henry was taking a little longer than me, I went to the overlook and took in the scenery while I waited. I saw movement in the trees beneath us when I was there. I just managed to catch a glimpse of a group of people, possibly 4 or 5, walking through the thick foliage. The fact that there were other people out here, especially not at the campsite, shocked me. I couldn't tell if they were campers, hikers, or anything else from where I was because all I could see was their simple forms moving through the forest. I made an effort to show Henry where they were, but by the time he arrived, they had already vanished into the jungle. We resumed our daily activities after a short while. For the next few hours, we essentially just hung there, chatting and doing other things till the sun began to set. We sat around a tiny campfire that we had made. For the first few hours of the night, everything was quiet. There was simply the sound of our conversation over the roaring campfire. Then we heard something different, though. It was dim, however, we both heard it. It sounded like several voices conversing with each other. Even if they were speaking our language, we were unable to understand what they were saying. However, it was quite unsettling because it came from deep within the trees. Henry and I merely listened for a while because we had no idea what to do. The sounds, however, appeared to remain still. They remained where they were until they abruptly became silent. The next minute or so was actually frightening. The voices did not disappear or fade away. They simply stopped as if they were still in the open. Then footsteps were heard. There was only one set approaching us. A figure emerged from the shadows and entered our campfire's glow a little while later. His black hair was long and wavy, and he wore a distinctive red baseball cap. He approached us with a broad smile. "Either of you know where the trail is around here?" "I've been looking for a while." "Yeah," I replied, gesturing to the trail in front of me. However, I questioned if the others were with him when he didn't say anything or walk away right away. For a minute, his expression dropped flat. Then he grinned once more and turned back to face me. I had no idea that there were other people out there. "I've been trekking by myself," the man stated. I would have asked them for directions if I saw them, but it was so odd that I was nearly certain he was lying. He came from the same direction as the voices we had just heard. I simply replied, "Okay." Henry was thinking the same thing as he grinned and walked away down the trail. The more unsettling question is, why was he lying? Why didn't he want to tell us about the others in the forest? We talked about this around the campfire for about half an hour, trying to figure out what the hell was going on, or even if there was anything going on, and the entire time it felt like we were being watched. The guy simply emerged from the same area as the group of voices and wasn't with them, or at least didn't notice them. We had never been this far out before, so it didn't help that something didn't feel right. I kept turning around and staring at the trail in the forest. Should we just leave? Henry eventually spoke in a trembling voice, and after giving it some thought, I agreed. We began packing, but the unsettling sensation just seemed to intensify. As we stomped out the bonfire and threw our luggage on our shoulders, after a moment, My shaky hand reached into the side of my backpack and pulled out my flashlight. I pointed it out and clicked it on, and there was that same guy with the red baseball hat standing just 10 or 15 feet in front of me, staring at us with a blank expression. A single footstep crunched in the leaves behind me, and we both swung our heads around. Without the fire, it was completely dark, and the woods seemed eerily quiet. He gave me that same big smile as before, so I turned off the light in a panic and we both ran to the trail. Unsettlingly, I could hear several other footsteps chasing after us, some even sounding like they were running through the woods next to us. But they gradually faded away until it was just the two of us running down the dark trail. We made it back to the car unscathed, got in, and drove away, but we were both pretty shaken for a while after that. To be honest, I have no idea what was going on. We haven't gone camping at all in a long time, and I'm not sure if we ever will. In 2019, when I was 21, I decided to go camping in the woods in my parents' backyard while I had the opportunity. It was a pretty impulsive trip. I just decided one morning that I'd pack my bag and head out for the night. I had done this a lot before, so it wasn't a special camping trip or anything. After telling my parents where I was going, I left at 4:00 p.m. to find a place to spend the night. After walking for a good hour, I found an open area that looked decent enough, set up my tent, cleared out a space, and lit a small campfire. It was really cozy, and the sun slowly setting made it even better. It was exactly the kind of night I was hoping for, but it didn't take long for it to be interrupted. I should have mentioned that these woods behind my parents' place were pretty vast and unexplored, because there were no trails around here, so running into someone would have to be very coincidental. I thought they would probably just pass by and that would be the end of it, but I heard a voice, a male voice, sort of muttering or talking, and I almost felt like it was echoing a bit because it was hard to pinpoint exactly where the voice was coming from. It was also dark enough that the shadows from all the trees made it difficult to see much, were possibly purposefully staying close to me. Eventually I called out, just yelling hello to see if they would respond. But before I could finish, the voice cut out and the forest went silent. I felt very uneasy, so I called out again, but there was no answer, and now I was a little more on the creeped out side. With only 20 or 30 minutes remaining of the thin layer of sunlight, I decided I would just move spots. There and be creeped out all night and let it ruin my experience. After a few minutes, I was heading back into the trees and searching for another place to call home for the night, but I didn't have as much luck. After 15 minutes, with the sunlight rushing me, I decided to just settle where I was, basically among all the trees. It was a good thing I did, though, because by the time I finished setting up camp, there was no light left. The sun had completely set, and the woods were silent. I built up another small campfire and enjoyed the warmth for a while, before grabbing my snack bag and getting some supplies to make s'mores. I got a small stick and stabbed a marshmallow on top and held it over the fire. I'm not sure why, but roasting a marshmallow over a campfire is just one of my favorite things to do. It helped divert my attention. I made a few s'mores and hung around the fire for a good long time, at least several hours. By that point, it was getting pretty late, and I was allowing the fire to start going out. It was still somewhat bright, but only half as bright as it had been before when I heard the crunch of leaves behind me. I thought it sounded like somewhere to the back left of my campsite, but it was completely dark. When I looked over there, whatever it was had stopped moving again, so I called out. To be honest, I wasn't expecting much given how the last time went, but a few moments later, a man emerged from the woods and entered the... "I didn't mean to frighten you," he replied, grinning as he casually approached the fire and took a seat close to it. But it startled me because he came from a different area than what I was looking at. He extended his hands to be warmed by the flames. He pretended to be there as though he knew me or something. Can I help you? I think you're at the wrong campsite," I replied with a no. It was an unnerving response to not contribute anything to, even though I wasn't sure which portion he was refusing. I had to consider what to say or do for a little while. As we sat by the fire without saying anything, there was an oddly uncomfortable moment. In retrospect, I probably shouldn't have asked whatever came to mind because it became so tense. "Are you the person I overheard conversing earlier in the trees near my other campsite?" The man's face clearly went flat, yet he continued to stare at the fire. "Must have been someone else," he remarked in a monotonous voice that was considerably cooler. All of this was really strange, but I still had no idea how to get out of it without running the risk of getting into trouble. A stick shattered behind me before I could give it much thought. I turned around. It came from the same location to the campsite's rear left. My heart fell. The dude wasn't by himself. There was another person present. I pivoted and glanced back at the campfire. He had his eyes fixed on me. To be completely honest, all I can recall is the extreme cold, lifeless expression in his eyes. I can't even recall if he was grinning, furious, or anything else. Immediately, I leaped out of my chair and ran into the forest. For a little period, I heard footsteps racing up behind me as one of the men spoke to the other, obviously frustrated. But I lost them as I moved more into the trees and into the shadows. Even though I grew up in these woods as my backyard, I could still make my way through them to the road and back to my parents' house. On my behalf, they dialed 911. To cut a long tale short, in the morning I accompanied a group of cops to the encampment. Everything has vanished. I'm not sure if that improves or worsens the situation. On the one hand, it might have indicated that they were merely there to rob me, but on the other, it was clear that they had malicious intent, so they might have been attempting anything. One of them did, after all, briefly pursue me. I never returned to those woods behind my parents' house, which shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. This was in the summer of last year. My dog Rocky and I were trekking along a trail to a little camping area. He is a medium-sized, intelligent Australian shepherd who travels with me everywhere. I always enjoy wandering through the woods and running about. I have visited this location 3 or 4 times earlier. I adored it because Rocky could run around unrestricted and have fun because it was remote and never had anyone else. It was just an hour or two before nightfall when we arrived at the campsite, which was 8 hours down the trail. There was nothing particularly noteworthy or beautiful about the campsite itself. There were only trees surrounding the tiny aperture. It was peaceful, pleasant, and safe for me to let Rocky wander around while yet being able to watch him. Rocky normally performs his short patrol about the campsite at this time, so I dropped my pack and got to work setting everything up. While I was still setting up our tent and unpacking the remaining items, I noticed him sniffing around and heading a short distance into the woods. Rocky returned to the campsite around 15 minutes after arriving, but he was acting strangely. With his tail down, he approached me directly before turning to face the direction he had just come from and gazing out into the trees. He hardly ever acts this way until there's a thunderstorm or he's terrified of something. I got up and tried to see where he had come from, but I couldn't find anything. He was all right, just nervous for some reason, so I checked him to make sure he hadn't stepped on anything and damaged himself. It was really unsettling, especially coming from a capable and intelligent dog like Rocky. As I completed putting up the camp, I remained vigilant in constructing the campfire. Rocky followed me around and maintained his eyes on the woods, never leaving my side to explore or do anything else. I'll admit that each time I turned to gaze at the trees, I had a weird, unsettling feeling that someone was watching me. Since I didn't see anything, I dismissed it as Rocky, which simply made me anxious. However, I never truly forgot about it. Just as the sun was setting, casting a thick shadow over the forest, I started the campfire. As usual, it was quiet, but I didn't feel as at ease as I normally did. Because of Rocky's strange conduct, I assumed I wouldn't. But I hoped that tomorrow would be more typical and we could resume having fun. However, I spent the night tending to the fire and spending time with Rocky while listening to the noises of the forest. However, Rocky abruptly raised his head and froze 1 hour after sundown. With his tail between his knees and his ears erect, he gazed fearfully out at the trees. I peered out, but everything beyond 20 or 30 feet was totally hidden due to the darkness that blanketed the region. He locked his eyes with the darkness behind the trees and began to whine softly. I reached for my flashlight and shined it out there, trusting him that something was amiss. Not seeing much, I began to proceed a short distance inside. Rocky was just behind me. I didn't want to go too far from the campfire, but after walking for about 50 feet, I couldn't find anything in the woods. We returned and took a seat. I knew Rocky wouldn't be doing this for no reason, even though I couldn't see anything. However, it appeared most likely, and I suppose I just hoped, that it was just some sort of animal strolling around. Even though we weren't in bear area, I wasn't too concerned because I had bear spray on, concerned about our security. Rocky didn't have any more unexpected moments, but he remained vigilant all night. We entered the tent and went to bed a few hours later. I was relieved to see Rocky close his eyes and go to sleep within 15 minutes because I could see he was exhausted, most likely from all the worry he was experiencing. Soon after, I followed suit. I had a dream that night about strolling through the woods at night, which may sound weird. I was by myself, I was just strolling across the area without Rocky. Trees not on a walkway or anything. I began to hear a high-pitched sound in the middle of the dream. It continued repeatedly until all of a sudden I was startled awake. I realized right once that Rocky had been attempting to wake me for some time, since he was pushing my face with his muzzle and whimpering in my ear, generating that high-pitched noise I was hearing in my dream. Feeling anxious, I sat up, picked up my lantern, unzipped the tent, and went outside to survey my surroundings. I switched on the flashlights and got ready to look around. However, as soon as the light turned on, it illuminated someone in front of me, perhaps 10 feet away from the tent. They were dressed entirely in black, with a hoodie covering half of their faces, revealing only their disheveled beard. However, I soon saw a reflection emanating from his hand, the little pocket knife blade reflecting the light back at me. I simply stopped in that moment like if my entire body had been shocked. The man also hesitated for a bit, but when Rocky started snarling, he began to go forward once more. Until that moment, I was completely unaware that he had emerged from the tent and was standing just behind me. The man hesitated as a result, allowing me more time to. I gather myself and hastily go for the bear spray inside the tent. Rocky was furiously barking and shifting back and forth, placing himself in our way by the time I got back up. The man simply turned and fled into the trees without taking any more steps forward. Fortunately, Rocky did not pursue him. He kept his head up and circled the campground, watching over the entire area, as I began putting things down and packed. After packing, we resumed our journey down the trail. To be honest, knowing how skillfully Rocky handled the situation made me feel less afraid, even if my adrenaline was still pumping throughout the entire trip back. We left after returning safely. I did my best to report the occurrence, but I believe it wasn't thoroughly looked into due to the location and other factors. In any case, Rocky was back to his typical self, content and exploring the forest as usual. On the other camping excursions I've taken since, at least I now know that it's best to simply go if he doesn't trust anything.